Winter in Anchorage, Alaska was no joke. I'd lived here my entire life, but the deep freeze that set in during January always had a way of making the world feel both beautiful and unforgiving. This particular winter was worse than most. The snow piled up faster than the plows could clear it, and temperatures rarely climbed above zero. Still, when my friend Eric suggested we go for a hike to the old mining trail, I agreed. Cabin fever had been getting to me, and I figured the cold couldn't be worse than being cooped up. We left just after sunrise, Eric's beat-up Jeep crawling through the icy back roads until we reached the trailhead. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and our breath hung in the air like smoke. The plan was simple: follow the trail up to the ridge, have lunch at the lookout, and make it back before dark. Easy enough. But nothing about that day went according to plan. The first few miles were manageable, even pleasant. The snow crunched beneath our boots, and the trees around us were draped in glittering white. Eric and I talked about everything and nothing, our voices carrying in the stillness. Every now and then, a rabbit would dart across the path or a branch would creak under the weight of the snow. It wasn't until we reached the fork in the trail that things started to feel wrong. The signpost, which should have pointed left toward the ridge and right toward the old cabins, was missing. In its place was a jagged piece of wood, as if someone had torn it off. Eric frowned and pulled out the map. "It's fine," he said, more to himself than me. "We'll just keep heading uphill." I nodded, but a knot of unease formed in my stomach. The forest around us seemed darker somehow, the trees taller and closer together. Still, I followed Eric, trusting his confidence more than my own instincts. By the time we realized we were off the main trail, the sky had started to darken. Clouds had rolled in, blotting out the weak winter sun, and the wind had picked up, sending flurries swirling around us. Eric's map was no help now. The landmarks didn't match anything we were seeing. "We should head back," I said, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. Eric hesitated. "We can't be far from the ridge. Let's just go a little farther." I wanted to argue, but the determination in his eyes stopped me. We pressed on, but with every step, my unease grew. The forest seemed endless, the trail barely visible under the fresh layer of snow. Then we saw the footprints. They appeared out of nowhere, a single set of tracks cutting across our path. They were human, but the strange thing was the size. The prints were huge, larger than any boot I'd ever seen, and they were fresh. "You think someone's out here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric's brow furrowed. "Maybe a hunter. But why would they be this far off trail?" Neither of us had an answer. The prints led into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. For a moment, we just stood there, the wind howling around us. Then Eric shook his head. "Let's keep moving. We'll figure it out later." The snow began to fall harder, and the wind whipped against our faces. It was getting harder to see, and my toes were numb despite my insulated boots. I'd started to question whether Eric even knew where we were when we stumbled upon the cabin. It was small and weathered, tucked between two massive pines. The wood was dark and splintered, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow. There was no trail leading to it, no indication that it had been used in years. But smoke curled from the chimney, thin and grey against the white sky. "Do you think someone lives here?" I asked. Eric didn't answer. He was staring at the cabin, his jaw clenched. "Let's check it out. Maybe they have a radio or something." The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of burning wood and something else, something metallic like rust. The room was small, with a single table, a chair, and a fireplace where the flames crackled softly. A metal pot hung over the fire, steam rising from whatever was inside. But the cabin was empty. "Hello?" Eric called out, his voice echoing. No response. I stepped closer to the table. A plate sat there, half-eaten food still on it. A fork rested on the edge, as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry. My skin prickled and I turned to Eric. "We shouldn't be here." He nodded slowly, but before we could leave, the door slammed shut behind us. We both jumped, spinning around. The door was closed tight, the latch rattling as the wind battered against it. Eric tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "It must have blown shut," he said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. Then we heard it, the crunch of snow outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I looked at Eric, his face pale. "Someone's out there," I whispered. The footsteps stopped. Then a low, guttural voice came from just beyond the door. "You shouldn't have come here." Neither of us moved, our breath caught in our throats. The door rattled again, as if someone was testing the handle. Eric grabbed the metal poker from the fireplace, holding it like a weapon. "What do you want?" he shouted. There was no reply. The footsteps started again, this time moving away. We stayed frozen, listening until the sound faded completely. It felt like hours before we worked up the courage to leave. The door opened easily now, and the snow outside was untouched, no sign of footprints. The forest was silent, the storm having passed. We didn't talk as we made our way back to the trailhead. It wasn't until we reached the safety of the Jeep that Eric finally spoke. We're not telling anyone about this." I nodded, but I knew I'd never forget the voice or the feeling that someone was watching us, even now. I'd grown up with it, the biting cold, the heavy snow, and the way the ocean winds could turn your breath into ice. But that night, the storm wasn't just another winter inconvenience. It was something else entirely. I was driving home from my aunt's house later than I should have been. She'd insisted I stay the night, given the storm warning, but I'd stubbornly refused. I had work the next day and didn't want to leave my dog Max alone longer than necessary. The roads were bad, thick with unplowed snow, and the visibility was near zero. Still, I figured if I went slow, I'd make it back in one piece. About 15 minutes into the drive, I saw her. She was standing at the side of the road, her silhouette barely visible in the swirling snow. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Who in their right mind would be out in a storm like this? But as my headlights cut through the darkness, I saw her clearly. She was waving one arm, the other clutching what looked like a small bag. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. Every horror movie instinct told me not to, but it was freezing, and leaving someone out here felt like a death sentence. I rolled down the window as I pulled up beside her. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my breath turning to fog. She nodded, her face pale and chapped from the cold. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "My car broke down a few kilometers back." She climbed in, brushing snow from her coat and settling into the passenger seat. Up close, she looked to be in her mid-30s, with tired eyes and dark hair tucked under a knit hat. Her bag sat on her lap, and she clutched it like it was something precious. "I'm Erin," she said, offering a weak smile. "Luke," I replied. "Where are you headed?" She hesitated. "Just into town. Anywhere there's warmth." That struck me as odd, but I didn't press. The storm was making the drive difficult enough without me trying to play detective. For the first few minutes we drove in silence, the sound of the wind and the wipers filling the car, but something about her demeanor felt off. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone behind us. "Is everything okay?" I finally asked, breaking the tension. She gave a tight nod. "Just shaken up. The storm, you know?" I didn't believe her. Her hands were trembling, and not from the cold. Still, I let it go. She was a stranger, and it wasn't my place to pry. We were about 10 kilometers from town when the headlights behind us appeared. At first, I was relieved to see another vehicle on the road, but something about it didn't sit right. The car, an old boxy sedan, was closing the distance fast, its headlights blinding in my rearview mirror. Erin's breathing quickened. "It's him," she whispered. My grip tightened on the wheel. "Who?" "The man who—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "He followed me. I thought I lost him when my car broke down." My stomach sank. "Why is he following you?" She didn't answer, but the terror in her eyes was enough. The sedan was right on us now, its high beams glaring through the rear window. My first instinct was to pull over and let it pass, but something about the way Erin was clutching her bag, her knuckles white, made me think twice. "Hold on," I said, pressing the gas. My tires slipped on the icy road, but the car held steady as we picked up speed. The sedan followed, its engine roaring as it matched our pace. Erin was practically curled into herself, her head down as if bracing for impact. The road ahead was a blur of snow and darkness, but I kept my focus, my heart pounding in my chest. "There's a gas station up ahead," I said. "We'll stop there and call for help." The gas station's neon sign appeared like a beacon in the storm. I swerved into the lot, my tires skidding to a halt near the pumps. Erin and I scrambled out of the car and ran inside, the bell over the door jangling as we burst in. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, looked up from his magazine. "Everything okay?" he asked, eyeing us warily. "Call 911, I said, my voice urgent. "Someone's following us." He didn't hesitate, picking up the phone as Erin and I crouched near the counter. Outside, the sedan had pulled into the lot, its headlights still on. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there, his shadowy figure barely visible through the storm. The police arrived faster than I expected, their lights flashing as they pulled into the lot. The sedan's engine roared and the car sped off into the night, disappearing into the whiteout. One officer stayed with us while the other pursued the vehicle, though I doubted they'd catch it in the storm. Erin didn't say much after that. She gave the officers a brief explanation, something about a man she'd met online who wouldn't leave her alone, but her words were clipped, guarded. They offered to take her to the station for safety, and she agreed. Before she left, she turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to stop, but you did." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I never saw Erin again, but I think about her every winter, whenever the snow falls heavy and the nights grow long, and I wonder if the man in the sedan ever gave up the chase. I lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where the nearest neighbor was a good mile away. Most nights were quiet, the kind of silence that was comforting in its consistency. But that night, the quiet broke. It started around 8 p.m. The snowstorm outside was fierce, the wind howling against the windows as I sat by the fire with a book. Then came the knock. Faint at first, but deliberate. I froze, listening. Another knock followed, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Please," a man's voice answered, muffled by the storm. "I'm lost. I need help." I hesitated. Letting a stranger in during a storm wasn't exactly something you did out here without a second thought, but the desperation in his voice was undeniable. I unlatched the door and opened it a crack. He stood there, snow caked onto his coat and hat, his face pale and chapped from the cold. "Thank you," he said, shivering violently. "My car. It's stuck a few miles back. I've been walking for hours." "Come in," I said, stepping aside. The wind gusted as he stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, collapsing onto a chair near the fire. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't answered," he said, his hands outstretched toward the flames. "Where were you headed?" I asked, handing him a blanket. "Fairbanks," he replied. "I'm supposed to meet my brother there, but this storm, it came out of nowhere." As he warmed up, I noticed things about him that didn't quite add up. His clothes were sturdy, but not the kind you'd wear for a long trip in sub-zero weather. He carried no bag, no phone, nothing but a set of keys clipped to his belt loop. His story seemed plausible, but something about his demeanor put me on edge. "Do you want to call someone?" I asked, gesturing toward the old landline on the counter. He glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "No," he said quickly. "I just need to rest for a bit, then I'll head out." The storm outside had only gotten worse, and I doubted he'd make it far in those conditions. "You can stay here tonight," I offered. "It's too dangerous to go back out there." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks. I appreciate it." The hours passed uneventfully. I offered him food, which he accepted without hesitation, and we made small talk by the fire. He said his name was Mark, that he worked in construction, and that he hadn't been back to Alaska in years. He asked a few questions about me, but nothing intrusive. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, I woke to a sound, the faint creak of the floorboards. My heart raced as I lay there listening. Another creak, closer this time. I slipped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from my nightstand. The living room was dark, the fire reduced to embers. "Mark?" I called softly, shining the light around the room. He wasn't there. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. I rushed to the door, stepping out onto the porch just in time to see him disappearing into the storm. "Mark!" I shouted, but he didn't turn back. I grabbed my coat and boots, throwing them on as quickly as I could. The storm was brutal, the wind cutting through me like a blade as I followed his faint footprints in the snow. They led toward the woods, where the trees loomed like shadows in the whiteout. I caught up to him near the tree line. "What are you doing?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. "You'll freeze out here." He turned to me, his face pale and hollow-looking in the faint light of my flashlight. "I can't stay," he said, his voice trembling. "I shouldn't have come here." "What are you talking about?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled away and started walking again. But this time, I noticed something else. The snow around him was undisturbed. No footprints followed his steps. I stopped cold, watching as he vanished into the trees. The wind died down for a moment, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I finally turned back toward the cabin, my stomach dropped. The footprints leading from the porch, the ones I'd followed into the woods, were gone. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, the doors locked, and my heart pounding. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in snow. There was no sign of Mark, no trace that he'd ever been there. I called the local authorities, explaining what had happened. They searched the area but found nothing, no broken down car, no footprints, no Mark. To this day, I don't know who or what he was. But every time a storm rolls in, I find myself staring out at the snow, wondering if he'll come back. I've always considered myself a cautious person. Living in Banff, Canada during the winter months, you have to be. The snow can pile up in hours, temperatures drop to levels that make your breath feel like shards of ice, and the wilderness is never far away. But no amount of caution could have prepared me for what happened that night. It started with a simple plan. My friend Evan and I decided to meet at a small pub on the edge of town after work. The weather had been cold but manageable, and the forecast promised only light flurries. We'd planned to grab a few drinks, catch up, and then head home before the roads got too icy. By the time I stepped outside, though, the flurries had turned into a full-blown storm. Thick, heavy snow fell from the sky, obscuring the world beyond the glow of the streetlights. My car, parked a few blocks away, was buried under a layer of white. "You're not driving in this," Evan said, his voice firm. "Just crash at my place." But I'd left my phone and wallet at home in my rush to leave that morning, and the thought of being without them for the night made me uneasy. "It's only a 20-minute walk," I told him, pulling on my heavy coat. "I'll be fine." Evan frowned but didn't argue. "Text me when you get home," he said as I stepped into the storm. The wind hit me the moment I turned onto the main road. It wasn't just cold, it was punishing, slicing through my scarf and gloves like they weren't there. I pulled my hood tighter and kept my head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. At first, the town was still familiar. Streetlights cast long shadows over the empty sidewalks, and the occasional passing car sent slushy sprays onto the curb. But as I moved farther from the pub, the storm intensified. The snow came down so hard that the world turned into a swirling blur of white, and even the closest streetlights seemed distant and faint. That's when I noticed the sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, a low, mournful howl that seemed to follow me. But as I paused to adjust my scarf, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was footsteps. I stopped and turned, squinting through the snow. The road behind me was empty, the snow falling too thick to see more than a few meters. I listened, but the sound had stopped. Telling myself it was nothing, I kept walking, my boots crunching in rhythm with my rapid heartbeat. The footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. They didn't match my pace. They lagged slightly, as if someone were trailing me. I spun around again, and this time I saw him. A man, bundled in a dark coat and hat, was standing under a streetlight about 20 feet behind me. His face was obscured by the storm, but he was clearly looking in my direction. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Can I help you?" I called, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, then another. Panic surged through me. I turned and started walking faster, my boots slipping slightly on the icy pavement. The sound of his footsteps quickened too, closing the distance between us. I reached into my pocket for my phone, only to remember it was at home. My heart pounded as I scanned the street for any signs of life, but the storm had swallowed everything. There were no cars, no open shops, just me and him. The man's pace quickened, and so did mine. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him, but the snow made every step feel like a struggle. He followed, his figure growing clearer as he drew closer. Finally, I spotted a small diner with its lights still on, a beacon in the storm. I sprinted toward it, throwing the door open and stumbling inside. The warmth hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop to enjoy it. "There's someone following me," I said to the man behind the counter, my words tumbling out. "Can I use your phone?" He nodded, his face creased with concern, and handed me the receiver. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I explained the situation to the operator. "Stay where you are," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." I hung up and looked out the window. The man was standing across the street now, his figure barely visible through the storm. He didn't move, didn't come closer. He just stood there, watching the diner. The cook came around the counter holding a baseball bat. "You're safe in here," he said, his voice firm. Minutes later, red and blue lights cut through the whiteout. The man turned and disappeared into the storm just as the police car pulled up. 2 officers came inside, their boots leaving wet prints on the floor as I told them everything. They searched the area but found no sign of him. I never saw the man again, but that night still haunts me. The way he followed me, the way he stood in the storm, just watching. I don't know what he wanted, but I'm grateful I found that diner, and that I'll never have to walk that road alone again.